Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Tonight we travel back to a frigid December evening in 1974, when the quiet hamlet of Raglan, Ontario, became the scene of a haunting mystery that would perplex investigators for decades. 23-year-old Beverly Lynn Smith, a young mother working on Christmas decorations at her kitchen table, was found dead from a single gunshot wound to the head. Her infant daughter was left crying upstairs, and her husband was away at work. With no signs of forced entry and nothing stolen, this seemingly senseless murder would launch one of Canada's most complex cold cases, filled with controversial police tactics, false confessions, and a trail of clues that refuses to grow cold. Let's dive into the disturbing details of the Beverly Smith murder. On a bitterly cold December night in 1974, in the quiet hamlet of Raglan, Ontario, a crime occurred that would haunt the Durham region for nearly half a century. 23-year-old Beverly Lynn Smith was found dead in her modest farmhouse, seated at her kitchen table, with a single bullet wound to the back of her head. The young mother had been working on a craft project, creating Christmas decorations, when her life was suddenly and violently taken. Beverly was more than just another statistic in Canada's crime records. She was a vibrant young woman, married to Doug Smith, and mother to a 10-month-old daughter, Rebecca. The Smiths had moved to their farmhouse on Raglan Road just months before the tragedy, hoping to build a peaceful life in the rural community, about 60 kilometers east of Toronto. The night of December 9, 1974, seemed like any other winter evening in Raglan. Beverly's husband, Doug, was working the night shift at General Motors in Oshawa, a common arrangement for many families in the area. Beverly was home alone with her infant daughter, something she had done countless times before without incident. What makes this case particularly haunting is the scene investigators discovered. Beverly was found still sitting upright at her kitchen table, surrounded by the Christmas ornaments she had been crafting. Her daughter was found unharmed, crying in her crib upstairs. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, and nothing appeared to be stolen from the home. The single .22 caliber bullet that ended her life had been fired at close range, suggesting Beverly likely knew her killer. The initial investigation revealed several interesting details. Neighbors reported hearing what they thought was a gunshot around 8:30 p.m., but in rural Ontario in the 1970s, the sound of gunfire wasn't necessarily cause for immediate alarm. Many residents owned firearms for hunting or dealing with wildlife. It wasn't until Doug Smith returned home from his shift the next morning that Beverly's body was discovered. The Durham Regional Police Service launched an extensive investigation, conducting dozens of interviews with neighbors, friends, and family members. One of the most significant early leads came from Beverly's next-door neighbor, Linda Smith, no relation to Beverly's husband. Linda reported seeing lights on in Beverly's house around the time of the suspected murder, and later told police she heard what sounded like a screen door slamming. The investigation also revealed that Beverly had received several strange phone calls in the weeks leading up to her death. She had mentioned these calls to both her husband and her twin sister, but had dismissed them as probable wrong numbers. In retrospect, these calls took on a more sinister significance. The police were particularly interested in a green car that had been seen parked near the Smith residence on the evening of the murder. Several witnesses reported seeing the vehicle, but descriptions varied, and in the pre-surveillance camera era of 1974, this lead, like many others, eventually went cold. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the apparent lack of motive. Beverly and Doug Smith were by all accounts a happy couple. They had no known enemies, no significant debts, and no involvement in any criminal activities. Beverly was described by everyone who knew her as a kind, friendly person who avoided conflict and focused on her family. The murder weapon was never found, despite extensive searches of the property and surrounding areas. Ballistics experts determined it was likely a .22 caliber rifle, one of the most common firearms in Canada at the time. This fact made tracing the weapon particularly challenging, as thousands of similar rifles were registered in the Durham region alone. The investigation was further complicated by the forensic limitations of the 1970s. DNA testing didn't exist, and many of the sophisticated crime scene analysis techniques we take for granted today were not yet available. The physical evidence collected from the scene was minimal: a single bullet, some partial fingerprints that yielded no matches, and trace evidence that provided no significant leads. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, Beverly's case gradually became one of Durham region's most notorious cold cases. Her daughter Rebecca grew up without any memories of her mother, knowing her only through photographs and the stories shared by family members. Doug Smith never remarried, carrying the weight of his wife's unsolved murder for decades. The case file remained active, passed from detective to detective over the years. Each new investigator brought fresh eyes to the evidence, hoping to spot something their predecessors had missed. The original investigators had developed several theories about the murder, but none of them led to sufficient evidence for an arrest. One theory suggested that Beverly's murder might have been a case of mistaken identity, as her next-door neighbor Linda Smith had received threats in the weeks before the murder. Another theory proposed that the killer might have been someone Beverly knew from her daily routine, perhaps someone who had become obsessed with the young mother. The investigation took an interesting turn in the early 1980s, when investigators began to look more closely at the pattern of similar crimes in southern Ontario during that period. While no direct connections were established, the method of the killing, a single shot to the head in a domestic setting, bore similarities to other unsolved murders in the region. As the years passed, Beverly's case became something of a cautionary tale in the Durham region, a reminder that even in the safest of communities, terrible things can happen. The case also became a source of frustration for law enforcement, who knew that somewhere, someone had information that could crack the case wide open. The investigation would take several dramatic turns in the decades that followed, as new investigative techniques emerged and cold case detectives began to employ innovative strategies to solve decades-old murders. But in those early years, the killing of Beverly Smith remained a frightening mystery, one that would continue to challenge investigators and haunt the community of Raglan for years to come. The case saw its first major breakthrough in 2007, when Durham Regional Police established a dedicated cold case unit. Detective Sergeant Steve Henkel took a fresh look at Beverly's file, applying modern investigative techniques to the decades-old evidence. What emerged was a complex web of relationships and potential suspects that had never been fully explored in the original investigation. One of the most significant developments came from a re-examination of Alan Dale Smith, who had lived next door to Beverly at the time of her murder. Though sharing a last name with the victim, he was not related to either Beverly or her husband Doug. Alan Smith had been questioned during the original investigation, but was not considered a prime suspect at the time. The cold case unit's investigation led to a sophisticated undercover operation in 2009. Known as a Mr. Big operation, this controversial but legal technique in Canadian law enforcement involves undercover officers posing as criminal organization members to gain the trust of suspects. The operation targeting Alan Smith would become one of the most extensive and complex in Canadian police history. Over several months, undercover officers gradually built a relationship with Smith, involving him in what appeared to be a criminal enterprise. The operation culminated in what seemed to be a confession from Smith regarding Beverly's murder. He provided details about the crime that appeared to match the evidence, including information about the .22 caliber weapon used in the killing. Based on this apparent breakthrough, Alan Smith was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in 2008. However, the case would prove to be far from straightforward. During his preliminary hearing, significant issues emerged with the reliability of the confession obtained through the Mr. Big operation. Smith's defense team argued that their client had been under tremendous pressure during the undercover operation and had fabricated details about the murder to impress what he believed to be dangerous criminals. They pointed out inconsistencies between Smith's supposed confession and the actual crime scene evidence. The case became even more complicated when investigators discovered that Smith had been diagnosed with cognitive disabilities that might have made him particularly susceptible to suggestion during the undercover operation. This raised serious questions about the reliability of his statements and the ethics of using such techniques on vulnerable individuals. Adding another layer of complexity to the case, Smith's defense team presented evidence suggesting that the original investigation had overlooked other potential suspects. They pointed to several individuals who had connections to Beverly and motives that had never been fully investigated. One such lead involved a local man who had allegedly made unwanted advances toward Beverly in the months before her death. This individual had never been thoroughly investigated, despite having no solid alibi for the night of the murder. However, by the time this lead was revisited, many potential witnesses had died or could no longer reliably recall events from so many years ago. The prosecution faced additional challenges when some of the physical evidence from the original crime scene was found to have been compromised due to decades of storage in less than ideal conditions. This made it impossible to conduct some of the modern forensic testing that might have helped strengthen the case against Smith. In 2014, after a lengthy legal battle, the charges against Alan Smith were stayed. The judge ruled that the confession obtained through the Mr. Big operation was inadmissible, citing concerns about the reliability of evidence obtained through such means, particularly given Smith's cognitive vulnerabilities. The collapse of the case against Smith was a devastating blow to Beverly's family, who had hoped that after 40 years, they would finally see justice served. Doug Smith, who had never stopped hoping for resolution in his wife's murder, expressed his frustration with the outcome, though he maintained his dignity throughout the proceedings. The investigation would take yet another turn in the years following Smith's release, as cold case investigators continued to pursue new leads and re-examine old evidence. They began to focus more intensively on the social dynamics in Raglan during the 1970s, particularly the relationships between various neighbors and acquaintances of the Smith family. Investigators discovered that several potential witnesses had never come forward during the original investigation, fearing repercussions in the close-knit rural community. Some of these individuals began to share information that painted a more complex picture of the relationships and tensions that existed in Raglan at the time of Beverly's murder. One particularly intriguing lead emerged from a former resident who recalled seeing a vehicle similar to the one described in the original investigation parked near a local bar on the night of the murder. The witness had never come forward before, believing their information to be insignificant. However, this new detail helped investigators establish a more precise timeline of events on the night Beverly was killed. The cold case unit also began to explore possible connections between Beverly's murder and other unsolved crimes in the region during the 1970s. While no direct links were established, patterns emerged that suggested the possibility of a broader criminal element operating in the area during that period. As investigators delved deeper into these historical connections, they discovered a disturbing pattern of unreported incidents in the Raglan area during the mid-1970s. Several women had experienced threatening encounters, but had never reported them to police, reflecting the different social attitudes of the era. These revelations added new context to Beverly's murder and suggested that the community might have been harboring darker secrets than initially believed. In 2018, the case took another unexpected turn when forensic technicians, using advanced DNA analysis techniques, were able to extract previously undetectable genetic material from items preserved from the crime scene. While the results didn't provide a definitive match to any suspect, they did eliminate several persons of interest who had remained on investigators' lists for decades. The new DNA evidence led investigators to revisit the theory that Beverly's murder might have been connected to criminal activities she had unwittingly witnessed. Her home's location on Raglan Road, which was relatively isolated at the time, made it a potential transit point for illegal activities. Some locals had reported suspicious late-night traffic in the area during that period, though these accounts had never been thoroughly investigated. One of the most compelling new leads came from a deathbed confession in 2019. An elderly man, whose identity has been protected by police, provided information about activities on the night of Beverly's murder that corroborated several previously unconnected pieces of evidence. While this individual denied direct involvement in the killing, their statement suggested knowledge of who might have been responsible. The confession led investigators to explore connections between Beverly's murder and a small group of individuals who had been involved in petty crimes in the Durham region during the 1970s. Several members of this group had connections to the area around Beverly's home, and at least one had been known to possess a .22 caliber rifle similar to the suspected murder weapon. In 2020, the Durham Regional Police Service announced a significant development in the case. Using advanced audio analysis technology, they were able to enhance recordings from original witness interviews conducted in 1974. These enhanced recordings revealed subtle details that had been previously inaudible, including a description of an argument overheard near Beverly's home on the night of her murder. The enhanced audio suggested that Beverly might have had an unexpected visitor that evening, someone whose voice she recognized. This detail aligned with the original crime scene evidence, which had always indicated that Beverly likely knew her killer. The lack of defensive wounds and the position of her body suggested she had been comfortable enough to sit with her back to the perpetrator. As the investigation approached its 50th anniversary, investigators faced a race against time. Many of the original witnesses were elderly or deceased, and memories had faded. However, the case had taken on new significance in the era of genetic genealogy and advanced forensic techniques. Cold case investigators began working with genetic genealogists to build family trees based on the DNA evidence recovered from the scene. The Smith family, particularly Beverly's daughter Rebecca, continued to advocate for justice. Now an adult with children of her own, Rebecca became an active voice for cold case awareness, speaking at conferences and working with advocacy groups for families of murder victims. Her efforts helped keep Beverly's case in the public eye and encouraged others with information to come forward. In 2022, investigators revealed that they had identified a promising new suspect through the combination of genetic genealogy and traditional detective work. While they haven't publicly named this individual, they confirmed that it was someone who had never been previously considered in connection with the case. This development has renewed hope that Beverly's murder might finally be solved. The case of Beverly Smith remains one of Canada's most enduring murder mysteries. It serves as both a testament to the dedication of cold case investigators and a reminder of how advances in forensic science can breathe new life into decades-old investigations. While justice has been delayed, the pursuit of truth continues, driven by investigators who refuse to let Beverly's story be forgotten. For the community of Raglan, now a very different place than it was in 1974, Beverly's case remains a sobering reminder of how a single act of violence can echo through generations. The farmhouse where she was murdered still stands, though it has been renovated and occupied by different families over the years. Local residents still speak of the case, and many continue to hope that one day the final pieces of this tragic puzzle will fall into place. As we approach the 50th anniversary of Beverly's murder, her case continues to evolve. New techniques in forensic science and investigative methodology offer hope that even the coldest of cases can eventually be solved. For Beverly's family, friends, and the dedicated investigators who have never given up on finding her killer, that hope remains alive, driving them forward in their quest for justice. The legacy of Beverly Smith's case has influenced how cold cases are investigated in Canada, leading to improved evidence preservation protocols and the establishment of dedicated cold case units in many police services. While the path to justice has been long and filled with setbacks, the determination to solve this case has never wavered, ensuring that Beverly's story continues to be told and the search for her killer remains active.